This is Kate. I am so glad you could all be here with us today on this webinar. I know folks are still kind of trickling in as it's only a few minutes after noon here, but I wanted to go ahead and get started. So we've got Laura with us, and thank you, Laura, for taking time to connect with our network. Just so folks know, if you joined by phone only, actually, no matter how you joined, you're on mute, but if you joined by phone without joining via the webinar on your computer, I cannot unmute you. So if it's possible for you to join by computer, that's an ideal way to participate. In a little bit, we'll open it up for questions and answers, but first I just wanted to turn it over to Laura.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here, and we had one question before we even started, and that was a question about the ACE pyramid as it appears in the deck of slides that you have on understanding ACEs. So that's what's up on the screen right now, and this and the question was, why are there sometimes some different images in my presentations or in Rob's presentations? So this one obviously is a whole life perspective from conception to death. It includes ACEs and then disrupted neurodevelopment and then social, emotional, cognitive impairment. And if you look then at the, how come I'm not going to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Hold on, it's just slow. So this is the original pyramid from Rob Anda and Vince Folletti's early talks and explanations of the study. And you can see here that the disrupted neurodevelopment section that's on your slide between ACEs and social, emotional, and cognitive impairment is not on this slide. The other thing that is on the slide are the two arrows that say scientific gaps. So what we found is that, well, this original ACE pyramid was developed as a way of explaining that at the time when the ACE study was designed, there were scientific gaps. We didn't yet have the neuroscience or the epigenetics that explained the mechanisms by which adverse childhood experience translates into social, emotional, and cognitive effects and risk behaviors. We now have a lot of that science, and we understand those mechanisms much better than we did. And so what we found is that some people would take this visual from the original presentations and assume that it was a current visual, that the speaker didn't know that the epigenetics and neuroscience findings have closed a lot of those scientific gaps. And so even very well-known speakers that talk about the ACE study will sometimes put this original ACE pyramid up and say, see, these scientists don't even know that neuroscience and epigenetics has explained this. That's not true. They do know, and you know too. And that's why we decided to add in yours the disrupted neurodevelopment and take the arrows out so it's clear that you do understand as a speaker that there's a neurodevelopment impact from ACEs, and that explains some of the social, emotional, and cognitive adaptations and the risk behaviors. Rob and I have learned from Elena Quintana, who's in Chicago at the Adler School. She has been thinking about how to represent epigenetics in this slide, and so Rob and I have been testing a slide that looks kind of similar to this. So if you see one of our speeches on the internet or YouTube or whatever, you might see this particular version where historical trauma has been added to the bottom of the ACE pyramid. And we put the arrow on the left saying that we know that epigenetics and neurobiology explain this course that happens over the life of populations and individuals, and that we also understand something about intergenerational transmission. And so we've been having fairly good responses to this slide, and this is typically how we develop new slides. Either one of you begins to test something and lets us know. In this case, Elena Quintana started to test this idea of having historical trauma at the base. And then we test it with a lot of audiences before we release it to you to make sure that there aren't going to be strange audience responses, etc. And this is sort of where I'm thinking we might head, although Rob and I haven't talked about it yet, but head to a something that doesn't have the arrows, but it's just an updated ACE pyramid that has historical trauma at the bottom. It runs historical trauma, which is informed by our understanding of epigenetics, increases the risk for ACEs, which increases the risk for disrupted neurodevelopment, which increases the risk for social, emotional, and cognitive adaptation and risk behaviors, etc. So what we're seeing here is just an evolution of thought based on not wanting audiences to make wrong assumptions about about what the pyramid represents. Can we see questions, Kate?
I can, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to. You should have a little option to raise your hand, and I can unmute you, and you can also type anything in the chat box that's a question, and I can read any questions that you have out loud if you want to type them in instead of raise your hand. Let's see, it looks like we might have one. So Mickey is asking, will these slides and the notes discussion be shared with us? So just a heads up that we are recording this webinar. Laura, maybe you want to respond to, I know that you'll be sharing some other slides later, and whether or not those slides will be accessible.
This set that I just gave you, I could share, but I'd rather clear it through Rob in terms of, are we ready for them to be used by you? We could share a PDF certainly just so you have reference. But I think we really are committed to making sure that the audience responses are not going to generate questions that where we haven't talked to you about what the answers might be. So we're not quite there with adaptations to the pyramid, I don't think, but I can talk to Rob and see what he thinks. Like, for example, we still have the word disrupted in front of neurodevelopment here. I'd rather say something about adaptive, because I think the core message is about adaptation. That was not the original thinking that Rob and Vince had. They really did think of it as disrupted, and so I need to check with Rob about whether he's comfortable with some language change here.
Okay, great. So we do have a few other questions. I'm going to go to the hands rather than reading from the box. So let me unmute you here, Dave, to start. All right, try talking. You should be unmuted.
Thanks, Kate. This is Dave.
Hi, Dave.
How you doing, Laura? It wasn't so much of a question, but just a comment regarding the modified pyramid, to say that we've been talking about this in Minnesota for quite a while, especially those of us that are of color that are out doing this, talking about the historical trauma being at the base. We didn't have the actual pyramid, so I think that this will be extremely helpful for us. Okay. Quite frankly, I don't have the technological skills to create that little piece, but we've been doing this, and that wasn't my idea. That was Sam Simmons who started using that. As far as I know, it was the first time that I saw it. So
I love that, and maybe just talking it through, maybe we don't need any word next to neurodevelopment. Maybe we just need the word neurodevelopment. Because historic trauma at least implies and allows you to speak to the epigenetics aspect, and neurodevelopment lets you talk about the neuroscience. So This really represents the talk more accurately than other versions, I think.
I agree with that, Laura. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to unmute Anna Lynn here. She had a related question. Anna, do you want to go ahead? Well, I'll read her question just in case she was not able to speak. So she said, we've been talking about trauma and the social determinants of health as both sources of toxic stress and thus have in some presentations added a layer to the triangle representing the social determinants of health. What are your thoughts about that?
I am finding audiences still getting confused about thinking that ACEs are not a social determinant of health. And when we separate them, and so I wouldn't know where to add it in the pyramid. There's been so much media about social determinants of health, which is awesome, and lots of education about it, but then not including yet, because the ACE science is still relatively new, that ACEs are also determinants of health. And the fact that they're so common in the population, in my opinion, makes them a social determinant of health, because the pattern is at the culture and social level. So I think we would have to work that through, how we make sure that we don't exacerbate that confusion. I can't tell you how many hundreds of times I've sat in meetings and they're talking about drivers of problems, health problems, and they'll be like, well, we understand the social determinants of health, but what are ACEs? And the sense is that somehow social determinants of health are separate and more powerful, so ACEs are less important, is what audiences often respond with, and I don't think that's the right message, because statistically it's not accurate. So I'd love to talk more about that with all of you, like how do we try to resolve that mental model shift that ACEs should be included in that thinking about social determinants.
Thank you. So it looks like that's all the questions that have been typed into the box so far. Just so folks know, you can, if there are any questions for Laura that aren't specifically about the slides that she's shared so far, you're welcome to ask about really anything at this point. And I know Laura has more content she can share with us during this call, but we really wanted to also leave lots of room for any questions that anyone has. So, oh, I see a question from Lindsay. Lindsay, I'm not sure, would you be up for, I'll unmute you and see if you want to just kind of speak to your question here. Okay, I've unmuted you. Lindsay? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read Lindsay's question since she typed it into the box here. So she said, I've been using the existing ACE interface slides specifically in our tribal communities here in Leech Lake in northern Minnesota, and have very much appreciated that we are going in the direction of adding the underlying historical trauma that affects people of color and my Native people in particular. As a Native person myself, this is difficult material to present on both a professional and personal level, as so often we repeatedly hear about all of the cards stacked against us, so to speak. Are there more resources available to assist our communities in developing and strengthening resiliency specific to our communities that are still living in the contemporary repercussions of historical trauma, and how ACEs fits into that? Kind of a big question.
Yeah, and it's a really important question. And the answer is absolutely there are more resources, and they're not neatly in a package of slides at this point. that Rob and I have created. I think we do have speakers in a variety of states that are testing slides and keeping in touch with us, and we also have a small group of Indigenous leaders who have offered to help us, and then I'm the bottleneck because I say yes to too much and then I don't get everything done. I apologize. A couple of things that I would say. I have a few slides that I almost always add to the standard deck, and I have encouraged Rob to begin to add them so that he has a chance to experience how they enhance the deck. I think we are in agreement now that they're helpful. One is from the 10 Tribes study that shows how a slightly different version of ACEs that adds boarding school and foster care to the typical list of ACEs. And that 10 Tribes study found the link between the higher the ACE score, and I usually call it AE, Adverse Experience Score, the higher the risk for alcohol dependence, so that people can see that link. And then I usually add a slide from a study of youth about how often they're thinking about losses that are related directly to the historical trauma that their people have faced. And those two are pretty powerful. They don't take a huge amount of time, but they are, they're definitely research-based. Both of those studies were done by Indigenous researchers, and I find them really useful so that we're not just talking about ACEs from the standpoint of Robin Vince's study, but we're also talking from the standpoint of other studies that, at least those two. When we were at the Family Policy Council, Sasha Silvano and I created a separate deck of resilience slides. It used to be on the FBC online course, but when the state took down that course, those got lost. And they're not really lost. I actually have them. So I'm hoping that in the next 6 months, we can kind of have a retreat with some key leaders around the country that are working with very specific audiences to kind of review what we have in our hands, what you know, and to come up with a module or a deck of slides that includes some more detail on resilience building. The resilience literature from Indigenous researchers actually uses some different terminology and some different concepts, and so it'd be good to talk that through. And then the last thing I want to say is that elders have recommended to me that I change the order of the slide presentation when I'm working with Indigenous audiences. They like it when I, early in the presentation, present the list of ACE attributable health challenges and do a little bit of conversation about, do you recognize these? Are these present in the population here? And it starts off with, we know we have high rates of those things, and then this talk is about not just the origins, but also how we're going to walk through the reclaiming of culture that will allow us to heal and recover and be the people that we know we truly are. That simple change in the order of the slides seems to help a lot. Those are the things I would say, but you probably have amazing advice for me, and I would love to hear it.
Thank you. And she did say that her microphone wasn't working, so maybe she'll be able to chime back in later. We did have one other question about resilience. Deb Sheehan asked, she'd love to hear more about social bridging and positive responses because people always want to know more about what they can do.
Yes. I think that the slides coming out of Washington's Foundation for Healthy Generations, where, as you know, I work part-time, so I oversee analysis of the Washington Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System data, and we did release a deck only to Minnesota and without without a full script because we're still working on script, but that includes information about social emotional support and 2 or more people that help. We're still doing analysis of the social bridging, although our preliminary look is really promising. That social bridging is for the concept comes from anthropology, and the question we asked on the Burfess was, how common is it for someone in your circle of friends and helpers to reach outside of that circle to receive or to give help to someone you don't know well. That's not the exact wording, but pretty close. And social bridging, we know from the anthropology literature that it's associated with healthier communities overall. And we're currently working on the differences between communities that have high ACE prevalence, that also have high social bridging. Do we see functionality, better daily functioning, less symptoms, and that sort of thing? Unfortunately, we had a change in the epidemiologist. One epidemiologist stepped out of her position. We're currently hiring the next, so we've had a bit of a delay. But we will have slides fairly soon on that, within the next few months. And social bridging does appear at our early analysis to be linked with healthier individuals, meaning they might still have a diagnosis of asthma or heart disease or a mental illness problem, but they're functioning better day to day, and they report higher levels of well-being, and they report better levels of things like having a primary care doc and doing better self-care. And so these indicators that we're looking at in terms of are people functioning better even if they still have health problems, which I think is really critical, because not, you know, I myself have health problems that probably have our origins in ACEs, and I don't really care that I have them as long as I'm not struggling with them. So that's kind of what our thinking is. The analysis is tricky methodologically because we have to do analysis at the community level because of the way the questions were asked on a different survey than the ACE score was asked. So it's been kind of tricky to do the actual methods, which is what slowed us down. Is there more to that question? It sounds like the main thing is you'd love to have the actual information in your talks, which I would too. So.
That's all the questions in the question box right now. I'll maybe give another 30 seconds here in case anyone has any additional questions that they have for Laura right now.
This is Becky. In your 30 seconds, I'll just chime in quick. When Lindsay's question came up, I thought immediately of the work that the George Family Foundation is doing about mind-body healing, which I'm guessing Lindsay may already know about. But we're currently, actually, right as I speak, training a cohort of presenters in White Earth that Lindsay's also connected with some. And David Knoyer was here for part of the day yesterday and shared videos from that they're in the process of creating from Native communities about healing, mind-body healing methodologies and those kinds of things, which I think it's that those local resources and resources that are emerging other places that as they can be woven into the resilience conversations can be really inspiring and helpful. And anyway, so I just wanted to sort of give a plug to that work that's happening here.
Yeah, so there is just an amazing explosion of new, relatively new, but also ancient information about healing and recovery. And one thing that Rob and I have been talking about is really healing and recovery can be thought of somewhat differently as resilience. Resilience means doing well in the face of great adversity, and the literature is mostly about, you know, who does well as opposed to sort of what's the healing journey and what's helpful on it if you've had trauma and adversity. And so I think I was sort of hoping we could have a national meeting or a larger conversation about some of these issues so that we can be generating common language around these issues. I'm just reading Bessel van der Kolk's new book, and he has a whole section about biofeedback, neurofeedback, and I think that's really promising. He talks about it in terms of healing and recovery as opposed to resilience. And as you know, Rob and I both have some concerns about the word resilience being tossed around and not sort of being able to peel apart and say, what do we actually mean by each of these words? So I'm kind of thinking we might head in the direction of taking a bit more time and getting a more comprehensive kind of view and working out what's the shared language that we want to build in the country, we meaning all of us, including you on the line, so that we don't head ourselves into a corner. And the corner that I'm concerned about is I've heard speakers that aren't using ACE interface materials stand up and say really kind of preposterous things. One speaker I heard stand up and say, well, neuroplasticity means that even if you have a hole in your brain, it will just fill in if you do the right things, right? So this leap to using pretty marginal kinds of science or no science at all to try to make the audience feel better. And so we want to talk about healing and recovery, but in a way that's real about some people may have a harder life, and it may be harder because it is harder, and there isn't a magical solution, that we also have to invest in the long-term improvements in culture in order to reduce the adversity and the trauma. And that, you know, there's a constant balance there. And I am not the expert on that balance, but I work hard at trying to make sure that I'm thinking consciously about where is that balance point where we're delivering hope, but we're also being realistic about some people's lives are really a lot tougher, and there's some good reasons that they are. I did write down the Georgia mind-body healing, though, and I will get back into that.
If there aren't any other questions right now, we could move into, Laura was going to share a little bit of slides that she shares about kind of related to the theory of change for it within the kind of context of ACE interface. So she was going to share those, and please, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to alert me, and then I'm sure there will be plenty of time for any other questions that come to mind for you after this series of slides. So keep your questions.
Okay, so this deck of slides that I'm going to walk through with you was developed based on a request from the Alaska speakers where they were confused about the resilience section and understanding why we use the frame in that we do. And after I did a webinar with them, they said, you know, we just honestly didn't understand what the ACE interface theory of change was, and we think you should make a deck of slides that starts every single master trainer training that says, this is what we're setting out to do. This is the theory of change that we're working on. So this deck of slides here is that deck that explains that. And when Becky and Kate and I were talking about this webinar, I realized because you guys went first, you haven't seen it. So I just want to walk through it with you and then get your comments. It does have a full script at this point. It is ready to go out the door. It may or may not be perfect, but it's good for us to start using, and it might be useful as you're training the next cohort of speakers. It might be useful to you. So the purpose of this slide set is to help you understand the theory of change and convey that theory of change to others that you're training to be speakers. And the core message here is that we are working to build self-healing communities, communities where the population that's most affected by adverse childhood experience and historical trauma are leaders of the changes that will improve health for the future generations. And our generation really holds this new science in our hands, and it can transform the future of public health, but only if we are able to shift the way we live with one another day by day. ACEs are too common to use a direct service strategy only. We also have to change the cultural norms and patterns and thinking in order to significantly reduce the ACE scores in the next population group. So we're presenting information about adversity and resilience, and we're inviting really a new social contract to emerge. The social contract is that the people most affected by adversity are leading the change in community, that they're recognized as talented experts in how people can navigate life given the experience of early adversity. That's a pretty big thinking change. It's a pretty big social contract change. We're inviting people to think and act differently. And our belief is that if we want prevention, intervention, and interdiction services to be supportive of leaders, then we need everyone to be shifting our thinking so that our behavior will also shift. So the structure in this talk is subtle by design. We don't think you can easily change people's thinking just by delivering directly, you ought to change your thinking. We need to weave in this invitation into the talk, and that's what the talk is designed to do. If this will. Hello, slide, you're supposed to change. There we go. So this slide comes from the Systems Thinking Science, and it's about the difference between simple problems and adaptive problems. I think most of you know this work, but I'll just review with you that simple problems are problems that can be diagnosed pretty easily. There are experts in the world who know the solution, and there can be a routine response to the problem. So an example would be there's an emergency. It might seem very, very complex at the time, but you know that in an emergency you can dial 911. There is a routine response that's been generated. But ACEs are not a simple problem. They're adaptive problems. And in adaptive problems, there's often time delay, a delay between when the cause occurs and when the effects occur. There's often interrelatedness, a bunch of interrelated problems that keep people from being able to have a simple diagnosis. There aren't experts that just know exactly what everyone should do, and there isn't a routine solution that will always work. And the reason that there isn't a routine solution that will always work is that in adaptive problems, every time there's a change in any part of the system, the rest of the system adapts around that change. So you have continually changing conditions. And so that's true with ACEs. ACEs occur in families, in the context of historical trauma, and ACEs, every time there's a, sorry, I'm getting a battery signal. Okay, fixed it. And when we see one generation healing and recovering, it changes the dynamics in the family. When we see a community step up and agree to prevent ACEs, it changes the dynamics in the community. And each of those change. We change ourselves, and that shapes community. Community changes itself, and that shapes us. So we're kind of continuously changing environment. So the best strategy for addressing adaptive problems is to engage in learning with others, and that's what this slide deck is intended to do. But we see audiences commonly want ACEs to be a simple problem. They want there to be an expert who will stand up in front of the room they want it to be you when you're speaking, who will give a recipe, a 10-point plan. This is exactly what you do. They want to be 911 for ACEs, and then everybody knows to dial 911, and then ACEs will be fixed. And that is not the nature of this problem. So we use the systems thinking iceberg. I think all of you are familiar with the systems thinking iceberg. It comes from the corporate sector as they were helping corporate leaders to resolve adaptive problems. They developed this tool that basically the message behind the tool is that we need to act on values and principles, the way people think, or mental models, in order to affect the structures that drive what's happening in society, and that we get more lasting change when we work to address the values, principles, and ways of thinking. In the systems thinking iceberg, those are called mental models. And so that's what the talk is designed to do. It's designed to address mental models and values and principles. So we know that in any human system, there will be conflicting values. That's just a part of the way humans operate. So we don't believe you have to change people's values. We do believe that we need to illuminate the principles and values that people already hold, but maybe are hiding in the shadows or are not the predominant ones that are driving the patterns in ACEs in society. The talk is designed to invite a change in thinking and to develop a new common language so that people can step into the role of leading change. And we're preparing people to mindfully and intentionally attend to safety in all aspects of the spaces that they create at work, at home. And we're asking people to develop new skills and accommodations and engage in sort of trauma-informed learning that includes time for collaboration and reflection and community engagement. And all of that kind of change is embedded in this talk in various different specific slides. So we're trying to illuminate principles, we're trying to shift thinking, we're developing a common language, we're embedding safety into the way we deliver, in part because we're delivering face-to-face with a very carefully designed script that is very kind in its approach and language. We're developing new skills and accommodation, and we're supporting continuous learning. We're avoiding telling people what to do or supporting quick fixes because those are not trauma-informed approaches and because they can backfire in a variety of ways. And one of the ways they can backfire is if people think, oh, there's a 3-step plan, I can take those 3 steps, and that allows me to avoid investing any personal energy in culture change. And really, in the end, we need people investing in the inquiry and the process of changing the norms that lead to high ACEs. So how are we illuminating values? We've crafted the presentation with 2 core values that run through the entire presentation from the start to the end. One is a fundamental respect for the wisdom in every human being. And the second is we value transformational change. We want there to be a shift so that every human being is valued and respected and has the optimal opportunity for safely growing up in society and being able to provide their core gifts to the community. So embedded in this presentation is that we illuminate these values. We don't directly debate them. And one of the ways we illuminate is to invite people to reflect on whether the outcomes that we see, the high ACE scores, the bullying, homeless toddlers, the rates of preventable disease, do these outcomes reflect the values that we actually hold? And nearly everyone will answer no, they don't. That's not really the legacy we want to leave. And so these are some slides that are placed into the talk in order to illuminate those values. This lovely picture of this father and a child raises our emotional expectation that we would have this kind of nurturing and closeness. And then we present, you know, what's happening with kids in their daily lives is not really what we want, and we have these pathways into poverty and homelessness that don't reflect our values. And then the slide 58, where we're actually asking about where the audience members will lead us. And that reflects the core value of everyone can contribute, everyone should be leading, and everyone's a valued leader. In 1964, just before Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Prize, he said, "There's nothing more dangerous than to build a society with a segment of society with no stake in society." He was talking about race, and certainly that is an important thing to talk about, but it also directly applies to adverse childhood experience, to ACE. People think certain segments of society are responsible for high health care costs, crime, a stagnant economy. And given what we know about the predictive power of ACEs, this is undoubtedly true, because ACEs increase the risk for these things. But the cultural gap between the needs of the population with high ACE scores and the population with low ACE scores is not there because the high ACE score people are problematic. It's there because we collectively are turning our backs on the circumstances that families and children face every day. That gap is there because of our policies, the social contracts that say that people that are affected by adversity should cycle progressively through ever more difficult circumstances through their too often shortened lives. And this progressive walk is not inevitable, it's environmental. And all of us are co-creating the environment. So the call to action has to do with sort of waking us up and saying we are building a society where some people don't have any stake in society, and we're doing that because we're failing to own up to our own co-creation of this huge gap between two groups of people. So when we take a trauma-informed approach to this education, there are critical factors in any trauma-informed approach. You know them, realizing the prevalence of trauma, which this talk embeds over and over, recognizing how it affects all individuals. We talk a lot about this in the neuroscience, epigenetics, and ACE section, and a little bit in the resilience section. We have to resist re-traumatization, and that happens through a deep understanding of how people are treated in society and what triggers re-traumatization, and by being aware that we're all participating today in a pattern, a societal pattern, where re-traumatization is common. And then we have to respond by putting knowledge into practice. And you all know the core principles of trauma-informed systems of care: safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. Safety is a topic that's directly presented in the script, but it's also a really vital condition that we rely on each other as presenters to be generating in the room. Safety and trustworthiness are principles that we thought of when we decided to design a product that requires face-to-face interaction with people. I can't tell you how many times a month, it's many times a month, where I'm pressured to just do this education in some kind of online environment where I'm not, you can't even hear my voice, it's just sort of an online course. Lots of people want and think that if you just deliver information into people's frontal lobes, that then they'll have it and walk forward. But that way of presenting doesn't allow people to attune to one another. It doesn't help people co-regulate with one another. Face-to-face contact is more likely to produce the kind of safety that allows everyone to be able to co-lead this change. As a speaker, you build a sense that you're trustworthy, and part of the script is intended to help you do that by saying, you know, these messages that we've included have been approved by Dr. Teicher, Dr. Anda, etc. But also we build our trustworthiness by not leaping too fast to telling everyone what to do. You damage your trustworthiness as a person who genuinely respects the wisdom in the room by jumping forward and saying, well, I know what you should do. Instead, holding that space open and saying, I want to hear what you believe would matter, increases your trustworthiness as a speaker. And then choice. People who've experienced a lot of adversity and trauma have had choice taken away from them, choice and control by definition. And they deserve to have the choice and efficacy in their own hands. And so this talk is really designed to prioritize choice and control on the part of the audience, that they can generate their solutions, that they can hold the science that's delivered with fidelity, that they're smart enough and able, and that then they can make choices once they hold that scientific information. And that is really critical. And when we deliver solutions too rapidly or deliver solutions in a sort of cookie-cutter mold, we actually are taking choice away again. We are re-traumatizing, in my opinion. And so we are always trying to strike this balance between giving enough information for people to think and choose for themselves, but not closing that, closing the door to their own choices and their own decisions about what would help. And collaboration and empowerment are just embedded at every turn in this talk. So I'm going to show you where we're inviting a change in thinking, and that change in thinking really is not only understanding the science, but it's a change in understanding that the people most affected by adversity are our leaders. They are our experts, and they are us. We are the ones that need to make this shift. And here are some slides that really invite a change in thinking. The two-track slide, which really reframes this notion that people who grew up in a dangerous environment are adapting and not, they don't have maladaptive responses, they have adaptive responses. We also have the school discipline, the Lincoln High School target graphic that explains that we can think differently about what discipline is and when we have difficult conversations and how to build on the scientific knowledge in order to be more effective with people that have experienced trauma. And then the oil slick invites a change in thinking about we can solve many problems at once. We don't have to be competing with one another for resources. We can thread the science through what we do and solve lots of problems at once. So the talk is asking people to develop a new way of leading and a common language so we can talk with each other about all of this information as we learn together. And we've got slides that specifically are about inviting people to lead differently. The slide 54, which is in the resilience section on individual capabilities. And we say in that the ACE study isn't a detailed roadmap, it's an invitation for us to be pioneers. So we're inviting the audience to develop their capabilities to take action based on the science. And then the community empowerment section invites us to think about how we co-create a different kind of community pattern and helps to introduce some new language for cross-sector and multidisciplinary work that's not just about the structures or committees or tables we sit around, but about the learning processes that we invest in together in order to make change. So these are just some examples of slides that are embedded into the talk that are about a new way of leading and some common language. We've intentionally introduced simple, repeatable headlines into this talk, and hopefully we're hearing people use them over and over in our communities. If we're not, then it's one of the feedback loops that now the, close to 400 speakers, they're using these materials. You can you can give us feedback and say, this short message is not getting repeated, so maybe we need to adjust it, right? So we can continuously improve the presentation so that we get this kind of common language that leaders across the country can use to talk with each other. So that brings me to a body of research that was done by Everett Rogers about diffusion of innovation. And Rogers studied how new ideas and new products actually get to the point where they become sort of common household items that everyone uses and has. And Rogers' body of work is best known for products, but he did some really interesting writing also about innovation in terms of ideas and new ways of thinking, and this model applies to that as well. And what he found was that only about 2.5% of people are willing to pick up and run with a brand new kind of idea or product, and those are the innovators. And he found that the next group of people would get excited based on seeing what the innovators were doing or thinking, and that it maybe had more potential than what they had been doing in the past. And about another 13.5% will become early adopters. So the group of people in the master training and speaker cohorts are probably in the innovators and early adopters groups. We're willing to step out in front, and we're willing to think differently, and we're willing to challenge one another to learn together and use a whole new way of understanding health and social problems in order to improve the society. I think we're probably at this place where what we're doing now is inviting the early majority to join us, that next 34%. This speech is designed to get to thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people fairly rapidly across the country. We're in 10 states now. We're currently negotiating with an additional 7 states. As you know, states go from their original 25 people to several hundred in the first few years. And so we've intentionally designed this to be a magnet for the early majority, where it just becomes such a common language and such a common way of talking and thinking that people can't resist, and they just have to join. So we're intentionally designing for that early majority to join, because in Rogers' findings that once you have that early majority, there's a tipping point where it becomes much, much easier to get significant innovation into every nook and cranny of the society. And that's what we want. We want culture change, right? We want this to just be, duh, everybody knows that, and everybody has already changed the way we operate with one another. And the second thing we thought of in terms of diffusion of innovation is that in scientific discovery, we have these translational steps that usually occur from the time where there's a brand new discovery to the time where there's new policy or practice in place. So it usually goes translational T1 is usually from bench science to small numbers, T2, clinical trials to observational studies, T3 is usually dissemination and implementation, and then T4 we finally see new policy. And typically there's 17 years for each of those translational layers. And so we would normally expect to have close to 100 years happening between the ACE discovery and new policy. And we're just too impatient for that. We wanted there to be a way that we could move directly from the discovery to the public owning this and holding it and making change in their own lives. And that meant we couldn't wait for university experts to develop the perfect implementation plan that then could be delivered to everyone, which, interesting enough, that's how Rob Anda was trained, that he should be at the CDC and he should develop the perfect implementation plan, and then he should go to the public and he should teach everyone, and everyone should do what the CDC official said. And he thinks better of that now. He says, no, the public has a right to know, and they have a right to know without waiting 100 years. So this particular tool is designed to very rapidly move from the scientific breakthrough to really new policy and cultural practice at the community level. We're also investing in whole new ways of leading, of coming together in new ways and finding people's strengths and acting on them, in using conversation and learning together as tools for changing the sort of network of people that are leading. And that's embedded also in the way we've built the master trainers and the speakers, that layered ripple effect to roll out to every possible social network that we can reach. And we've built a way to change the narrative and change the language. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I have a little signal that says my connection to the webinar server was lost. You can see me?
Yeah, we can see your screen and we can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to ignore that little note that arrived for me. Okay, so this is, we've also tried to use the literature on how we reframe narrative and make meaning. And these are some of the things that help people to do that. Pauline Boss is one of the leaders that we relied on to embed a different narrative into this talk. And after Rob talks, he often has people walk up and say, oh, now I understand my life differently. They have a different understanding of their own narrative, and they're essentially reframing that from a story that used to generate shame and a sense of brokenness to a story where they say, oh, I had a normal response to the experiences I had. I adapted like everyone adapts. I just had a different set of experiences. And so that allows them to reframe the narrative of their own life in a way where they're thinking, I understand myself a lot better, and they can drop some of the shame and blame and fully engage in the leadership role of the community. And so part of the talk is we're inviting us to name this problem, to have some language around it, and then we're engaging in some rituals in terms of listening and then dialogue. Embedded in this talk is some strong sense of forgiveness in terms of self, and the notion of living into hope, living into a better future, and that we're all leading it. So we've tried to embed some of those in the talk as well. Pauline Boss also talks about what generates belonging and support, and we've designed an educational plan that includes some of these important factors so that people have the experience of belonging, even if it's just for a 45-minute talk or an hour and a half. And you are the agents of creating that safe space where people can feel a sense of belonging and welcoming and support. And from that space, we feel like people can step into leadership roles. So we've also invited some kind of strategic action by giving some examples of what people are doing with the science, so that folks have a sense of what could be done, and it builds their ability to imagine. So these are just a couple of examples that are included in the talk. And we're embedding safety into the talk. The delivery method itself as a face-to-face method is intentionally about safety. We've carefully crafted and tested the content, and you are continuously refining and improving that testing so that we know that audiences feel comfortable, they feel safe, and they feel like they're the ones that we're relying on to lead. We're also working on expanding this knowledge through peer-to-peer, person-to-person contact, and this kind of ripple effect. And all of these were designed into the talk in order to increase safety. We do have a little bit of information in the talk, and that's what we were talking about earlier, that we want maybe a larger section on psychological safety and self-regulation and what helps people with healing and recovery. And so that's a place probably we could expand. But we do have a little bit in the talk where we've talked about this, and also the methods that you use invite reflection and being mindful of one's body and practicing connection. So some of these things that help are actually embedded into the talk itself.
And Laura, it looks like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's okay.
Go ahead, Katie. We saw the same thing.
Yeah, it looks like we lost your screen. So maybe that was why you got that message before.
So that's, maybe we'll just wrap up. Let me just say that if you could still see my screen, there are a few more slides that just walk through how we've embedded these changes into the talk. And we just close by saying there really is a danger in telling people what they should be doing, and that danger is that we would sort of close the safe space for people to use their own experience, and we don't want to do that. So the talk is to leave that space open so that communities can be invest in healing.
So there were a few comments throughout that set of slides that you were just sharing, Laura, so maybe I'll read the 2 comments. So the first one is, Laura, I appreciate hearing you and Dr. Andar considering the language and understanding behind speaking about resiliency within this framework. There's been some pushback in the Native communities I work in when I talk in general about resiliency, specifically because of the concern that it will be used in a way to simply dismiss the very real concerns and issues that need to be addressed, both within our own communities and in reconciling our cross-cultural relationships. The people voicing these concerns say that while yes, our people are resilient because we have had to be, we also need to work at the system and institutional levels to really be able to move the bar. I realize this is work that needs to take place over time with changing environments and systems, as you've said. As I listen more to the direction this conversation is going, it seems like you are giving many examples of integrating this. Just wanted to share some of the feedback that I've heard time and again when working in my communities. One other comment was, what we're beginning to learn is that challenging a person's mental model or worldview can have the same impact as a traumatic event. And then there was a note, so sorry, go ahead.
There that let's put a placeholder there that we need to talk more about that. How do we challenge prevailing mental models without it being trauma? How do we, maybe we don't challenge, but how do we invite new ways of thinking that will lead to lower adversity? Because we don't want to trigger trauma. So I just want to put a placeholder for a future conversation there.
Yep. So one other note was that, so just so you know, we didn't get beyond the slide that mentioned, or that said 62 on it. I think it was mentioned slide 62. So that's where we were. And
then, you got, okay, got it.
And then, so Dave responded about worldview and said, you don't challenge, it's more about providing additional data and more later. So another placeholder for that conversation. So Anna Lynn followed up again, I think on a related note, saying, can someone explain more about challenging mental models is associated with triggering trauma? So Dave, I don't know if you want to speak to that. I can unmute you and see if you want to respond. Dave?
Yeah, thanks. What we're beginning to find out, there's a lot of work going on around mental models and worldview right now. And what it's tending to point to is that when you challenge a person's worldview, you're challenging their core values and their belief structure. And that in fact, what you do is the reason we get the really heavy pushback from people is that we are challenging their core values, and it has the same implications in activating the amygdala into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so what we're trying to get to now is not challenging the worldview or the mental models, but talking about how do we actually listen to one another, how do we talk to one another, and how do those mental models form, and then how do you begin to I forget what the word is, but if you start to take apart how mental models are formed and begin to look at it from that standpoint, and then talk about the new data that could be brought to a person and allow them, because you can't change a person's mental model and core values. They have to do that themselves. But the way that you do that is through the dialogue that brings more information, more data for them to consider.
Well, it's one of the reasons that I think that we're illuminating some elements that they already hold, but that for whatever reason have gone into the shadows.
Yes.
And they can choose to pick up that illumination or not, right? Because the core principle we're working with is choice. But we can at least introduce into the environment some illumination of some aspects that we think are pretty universal. Universally, we desire safety. We might have different views on what it is, but it's pretty core human. Well, it's pretty core for all living beings.
Absolutely, Laura. We're saying the exact same thing. We're not going to change it. We have to give people the information and allow them to do that themselves. But we have to figure out how we give that to them. What's the delivery mechanism? Those types of things.
Okay, so there was one previous question too I wanted to get to. Antonia had two questions. One was about how can we get new slides, and Antonia, one thing I'll respond to is there were new slides from Laura recently for the resilience section in particular, and then there were a few other slides as well that were new, and I sent out a link to those, and if you or anybody didn't get that, just let me know, and I will connect you to those new slides. And one other question from Antonia was about wanting to revisit the social determinants of health. And she says, at the state, we are working on using equity lenses for policy making. Do you know if anyone around the country is doing similar work?
Well, we certainly are in Washington, and there are many states actually that are investing heavily in an equity lens. What I'm noticing is it means different things in different places. And so I also think that, you know, our group of speakers and facilitators really have a pretty sophisticated understanding of how inequity is generated. That's, you know, many routes. About around equity and make sure we're not losing track of historical trauma and ACEs as an element that drives inequity. It's not the only one. There's lots of things that do, but often these two things are missing in the inequity conversations that I'm in. I was just at an RWJ, huge event, and equity was a big theme of it. And in a lot of the conversations, there just wasn't any acknowledgement of where historical trauma and ACEs fit in. Equity was seen as a current policy issue, which it certainly is, but not as accumulation over multi-generations and over a life course. So the notion of accumulation, at least in that conversation, was not embedded in the equity conversation. So I'd like to see us take on the challenge of thinking through how would we frame it? What would we say?
And Antonia responded and said, thanks, we introduced our community innovation grant from Bush with historical trauma / ACEs presentation with Sam Simmons and Sandy Whitehawk.
Yay!
Are there any other questions from anyone at this point? Or feel free to raise your hand. Always happy to have more voices. Okay, Antonia's got her hand raised here. Hold on. Okay, you should be unmuted, Antonia.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much for these words of encouragement, because I do not forget ACEs ever in my work around equity. And the questions that we have been asking here at DHS and really engaging in a whole effort to change and provide infrastructure is really looking at who are the populations impacted and what we know about it. So that provides an opportunity for us to infuse ACEs as well as infuse how their lived conditions can impact how they may or may not access their resilience, but always recognizing the fact that there are both challenges in these communities, but also a wealth of assets. Thanks again for the core principles of trauma-informed systems of care. That's something I'm going to bring to my Bush Foundation group meeting, because what we are trying to do in this 2-year grant is really how can we implement authentic community engagement so communities have a voice in telling us what policy, what programs work best for them, rather than our state bureaucracy making those determinations from the inside.
Mm-hmm. And I'm doing some work right now in Southern Oregon, because I missed my community work, so I took this fabulous and amazing contract. It's fabulous and amazing because I get to be on site, hands-on with lots and lots of folks. And we did 47 interviews, key informant interviews, to get a quick snapshot because we don't live there. And then now we're starting to do work. And what I learned in that process is that people were talking about community engagement as if community engagement equals having a parent on an advisory committee. I know you guys are way past that, but I don't think the nation is way past that. I think we're still a little confused about what engagement is. And it's one of the reasons I feel so strongly that, face-to-face interaction, having conversations about real and important things that respect, everyone's leadership roles in the change, that's really powerful. And it's gotten common in our circle of friends and colleagues, but I don't think it's that common out in the world. And the professionals in this place that's doing actually stunningly impressive work in general, but there's a big divide between the professionals and the residents of the community. And so we said, well, we're going to host a community cafe where we're just going to invite parents and other residents to come. And 130 parents showed up, and we asked them, please put your name and your email address if you'd like to co-lead a change in your community. And well over 50 people gave us their names and emails. And of course, folks were like, oh my goodness, that's really a lot of people that want to lead. And I think that's sitting there all the time.
I agree. I think that we need to really help, and that's the intent of this 2-year grant from the Bush Foundation. So David Ellis and his associate Jerry provided training in the art of hosting, and he can speak more to that. And we invited our employees from all different administrations within the agency to learn about this new way to engage in conversation, excuse me, that does not entail the traditional coming into a community center, presenting a set of slides with a lot of acronyms, and then pointing to the audience and say, do you have any questions? And that is really a shift for us. And what I noticed with the 16 people that are in this journey with us, it is also a shift for them, how they see themselves, how they're transforming so that they can lead. And we are a very large organization, but it is going to be my small attempt and believing really in the rippling effect, that once I start with a small group, then people are going to learn more about it and will want to do the same. But I am painfully aware of how traditionally we tend to believe that we're doing community engagement when in reality all we are doing is community outreach, which is quite different.
I love your work. Yay!
We're having fun.
Yeah.
All right, if anyone else wants to raise their hand and bring their voice in, we have 10 more minutes scheduled. And also there was a question that came up wondering if we could get a reference to the 10 tribe study that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I'll, why don't I send to you, Kate, the article, and then you can just circulate the actual article.
Okay, great.
I'm pretty sure it's in your bibliography, but it's such a big bibliography, it's too hard.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment.
So I'm wondering if anybody would want to share how the relationship with new cohorts of speakers, how that's developing, and because you're the first state with so many speakers in the field, are there things you could share and teach me about that process or anything that I need to know about it?
I'm looking for hands raised here. I don't want to just point at Dave, but I know he's one of the people who's part of the call right now, who has really done a lot of training of presenters. There are also a number of presenters on the call. Okay, Dave raised his hand, so I'm gonna call on him here. Okay, Dave.
I only raised my hand because I didn't hear all of Laura's question because my pesky cell phone rang.
Oh.
I'm curious about the experience of providing education and support for speakers, because your state has done more of that than other states, and I'm wondering if wisdom or experience that you can pass on to me about how that's working, where the challenges might be, and also just what Rob and I have been talking about kind of what's the burden in terms of time and effort for supporting a lot of speakers. Like, how is that going as you expand?
Well, you know, I guess from my perspective, for me, it's not a big burden because I don't get that many requests from people to help them go do this. I think that people get trained and, either they go and they do it or they have someone that they're working with. But from my perspective, there has not been a lot of people, at least within the state, who we have trained who have followed up and said, hey, will you work with me with this?
Okay.
More often, it's like the one that I just sent to Kate Becky, and I think they forwarded on to you regarding the state of New York.
Yes.
Yeah, that's typically where I get mine, or I'll get someone who has heard me or someone else speak that asks, would I come and do a presentation?
Okay.
I'm going to switch
This is
over.
Becky, and I don't know
Sorry.
how well I can be heard. This is Becky. I'm not sure. When I spoke before, I got a message that I wasn't heard very well. So I've been hesitant to speak.
We can hear you.
Okay. Well, actually, I think to Laura's question, Kate, you're probably the one who connects the most with the most of the new trainers and presenters, and we've also been sort of figuring this out as we go. There have been, I would say that there's some who sort of hit the ground running, and others who take a little more time, and we've been sort of, as Dave mentioned, not hearing, we on one hand, we tried to maybe potentially get people connected with more experienced speakers, but that hasn't really taken off. So we're still learning in that process, and I guess, Kate, I think you might have, I don't know, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but your experience sort of being that point person might be of use here too.
Sure. So kind of, I think what Dave and Becky shared are both really accurate, and I think, you know, from my experience, I think that people who are trained as presenters, like each cohort we've trained, I think that people have really co-presented with others in their cohort. So I feel like, you know, the bond that we've tried to build between folks in that 2-day training, I think they kind of take off with others from that cohort. So I think we've done a little bit, there's been a little bit less bridging between folks in that first training cohort and then presenter cohorts beyond that than maybe we would have expected.
Kind of makes sense though, because you spend 2 days together, and so you get to know each other, and you know, you have a sort of an even playing field, so to speak, where we all kind of in the learning curve together. So.
Yep, and I know I saw a hand from Ruth Charles. She may have dropped it here, but she is a new presenter. Yep, she's raising her hand here again, so hold on, we'll get her perspective. Okay, Ruth, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm in southeastern Minnesota, and there really aren't many. I don't think there is. The closest presenter to me is about an hour away. I teach at Winona State University, and so I'm used to teaching. And this spring I've been on sabbatical, and basically what I've been able to do is mainly community organizing. I'll speak to whoever wants to hear about ACEs. And I've done everything from 20 minutes with the Kiwanis and the Rotary to an hour with hour and a half with a couple of our schools. And I'm also working with Paper Tigers, the movie. We brought it in and showed it at our Frozen River Film Festival and had a really great turnout for that. And I bought a copy, and I'm actually showing it 3 times this week to the teachers, to the administration, and then also to a Miller mentoring group. It's mentoring kids that are at risk. And how I've set it up is I'll just do maybe 5 minutes beforehand, because the movie doesn't so much talk about ACEs, but I just give them 5 minutes. And, you know, in one way that I kind of engage people a little bit so that they're not quite so defensive is I often ask the group, when's the last time you took a human biology class? And that kind of says, oh, you know, and so I says, me neither. And so, but this is what I've been learning. And this is, and so that kind of gets us in a little different mode where they aren't quite so defensive because they realize, wow, we're learning so much about the brain. But it's been very slowly that people are learning, and when you present it to them, it makes sense. Yesterday, I presented to a group, it's the Winona County Alliance for Substance Abuse Prevention, and seriously, they've been doing the same old stuff, trying to work with issues of addiction. And I talked a little bit about ACEs and then talked about neuroscience and, you know, and just the whole issue, you know, instead of why'd you do this, what happened to you to make you behave this way? And making that tiny shift is making a huge difference.
That's exciting.
So.
And it's exciting to have Paper Tigers as a new tool because it's a film that was made so well. It's such high quality. I mean, we've had little video clips to use in various things before, but to have a really high quality film is useful.
Another resource that I also have, I haven't used this yet as much, but the video Healing Neen, N-E-E-N, because she also talks about ACEs and Vincent Folletti's in it, and they, you know, because especially when you're dealing with addiction, it makes such a difference to understand how people, you know, when you ask the question differently, and that was in her case, it made such a big deal.
Uh-huh.
So we've got one more hand raised from Anna Lynn. I'm aware of the time, so let me just, I'm going to see if she's got a quick comment here right before we end. Anna, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm getting a lot of feedback. I wanted to ask a question about the word culture change. I understand that you're, or I think you're trying to speak, hold on a second. Okay, so I think when you talk about culture change that you're talking about the broader umbrella of change, not just, you know, our cultural heritage, but you're talking about changes in our society, including policy and systems changes. But I'm wondering if that word is confusing sometimes, if it maybe obfuscates the need for policy and systems changes, or perhaps worse, like it really speaks to just changes in our cultural heritage kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that the word has many popular meanings, and I was speaking of it in terms of changing the patterns of thoughts and beliefs that drive the current picture of outcomes that we see. Not cultural heritage, because a lot of times when we reclaim cultural heritage, those patterns that are driving the negative outcomes go away. So that it can be very positive to reclaim cultural heritage. But nevertheless, when we look at the sort of the patterns of thoughts and beliefs that drive the patterns of behavior, we see a lot of ACEs. We see a lot of exacerbation of historical trauma. We see a lot of things that we wish we weren't seeing. But I agree that the word can be problematic. I've been working quite a bit with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Their new mission is a culture of health, and so I probably need to learn how to be more careful how I use that word. But I have an article that they commissioned that's about building self-healing communities as a culture of health strategy. So that's sort of the origin of that language coming up from me. But it's more than just systems and policy change. It's also just how we live with one another day by day forms a current culture that isn't consistent with our historical cultural identities. If I look at the ways that the indigenous peoples that live near my house, what their stories of how they live together day by day do not match the way we now live every day. And so we do need to think about, what does that mean? What does that mean about what we really want? And they would say the same thing I said. I mean, I'm not speaking out of turn. They're working really hard to reclaim their ways of being with one another that are their ancient ways that were really stolen through the federal policy and through racism and other really horrific kinds of experiences that they've had.
Well, it is 1:35 here, so I don't want to, want to be aware of everyone's time. And I know that other questions might come up. I want everyone to know that feel free to contact me with questions at any point. And also you'll get a survey tomorrow that asks just for any feedback you have on other things you'd like to talk about with Laura potentially in the future and things like that. So unless anyone has any pressing last minute things, I think we will close for this conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
All right. Bye, everybody.